Emio the Smiling Man is out, and it is a magnificent entry in the fantastic and venerable Famicom Detective Club series. But one thing that stood out to me in the credits was Yoshio Sakamoto's co-writer, and when I looked that person up, I realised, hidden away and presumably largely unlooked at by people avoiding spoilers, is what seems to me like a fairly big bombshell revelation by Nintendo themselves and out of the mouth of Yoshio Sakamoto in person, that he actually named his successor on the Detective franchise. In the same interview, there is some curious wording related to Tomodachi Life and some insight into how a long-dead Nintendo franchise came roaring back to life, which I find really interesting, if slightly depressing, as a reflection on how Nintendo's mindset works when it comes to some of their most valuable properties. I don't normally do especially newsy videos on this channel, and I'll still be looking at this interview through an analytical eye, but this is classic Nintendo forecast stuff I haven't seen anyone else covering, so let's get into it. I recommend checking out the actual article, which is linked below, but we'll take a moment to review some of the bigger revelations and statements and to discuss them. Also, for anyone interested on my own thoughts on the Emio game, please stay tuned to the end. So, all this has been explored in Nintendo developer interviews for the new Famicom Detective Club game, Emio the Smiling Man. In the interview, development duo Yoshio Sakamoto and Kaori Miyachi discuss the series history, some surprising information about how mages came to work on the property, give a lot of insight into the commissioning process for the series, and how Yoshio Sakamoto and his team work, and discuss the franchise's future. Firstly, we should meet the woman credited as Sakamoto-san's co-writer on this game, Kaori Miyachi. Miyachi introduces herself for us. I've been working mainly as a coordinator on games in a variety of genres, including Donkey Kong Country Returns for Wii, Art Academy for Nintendo DS, and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate for Nintendo Switch. I also worked as a coordinator on various adjustments to the remakes of Famicom Detective Club, The Missing Heir, and Famicom Detective Club, The Girl Who Stands Behind on Nintendo Switch. In fact, Miyachi-san's history with Nintendo is a long one, going back to Battalion Wars 2 on the Wii in 2007, but she has almost always been in a supervisory or coordination role rather than really at the heart of game development, and she describes how basically it was Sakamoto-san who brought her into the heart of game development. She explains that as she joined Nintendo, she realised that she needed to try a wider variety of video games than she had experienced previously. She said, "I like RPG games where you level up a bit by bit, but after I started working here, I thought to myself, I'd better give it a go first before passing any judgment, so I played a whole bunch of games across a wide range of genres. Some of these were adventure games, and I was introduced to a world of gaming I'd never experienced before. As for Famicom Detective Club, I'd heard of it, but hadn't had the chance to play it. When I was assigned as the lead for the Mages remakes, my first task was to complete Famicom Detective Club Part 2, The Girl Who Stands Behind, on Nintendo 3DS Virtual Console. Once I'd actually played it, I was blown away. I honestly wondered, why haven't I played this before?" Of working on the 2021 Famicom Detective Club remakes, Miyachi-san comments, "For me, it was a great opportunity to get to know mages, but more than anything, being able to work side by side with Sakamoto-san, who's created a lot of things at Nintendo, was really huge. I learned a lot about Nintendo's unique way of creating products, its perspective, and philosophy." But in many ways, I think what's fascinating about the picture that this interview builds up is that Sakamoto-san, as talented a creative mind and storytelling genius as he doubtless is not a particularly tenacious producer. He said to Miyachi-san that he was thinking of a story called Emio the Smiling Man, and she replied encouragingly, "Well, that sounds interesting," and then followed up with him a couple of months later asking, "How is the story about Emio going? I'm looking forward to it." Sakamoto-san said, "I interpreted this how I wanted. Someone I've always wanted to rope into development is asking me these questions. I see what this means. She must want to be a part of it. So I thought I'd better get serious about writing this story." But Miyachi clarifies, "I never said I wanted to be part of the development. I was just genuinely looking forward to it. And here I think we see that Sakamoto's approach to team building is very tentative. And this links to another aspect of the interview that is really surprising on a number of levels, which is quite how crucial mages were to the revival of this series. It is slightly depressing that even a series that Yoshio Sakamoto loved working on, a series which had quite a following on its own, wasn't brought to market initially because of a vision at Nintendo to revive it, but because of the tenacity of a third-party developer. Sakamoto explains the 2 remakes for Nintendo Switch were made possible thanks to Mages, a game company that has produced a lot of adventure games. An employee from Mages pitched the idea to Nintendo with incredible passion. Even during a different meeting between our point person for external developers and Mages, they brought up the subject by saying, "By the way, we've updated the remake proposals we talked about the other day, and we've also updated the video materials. Here's what we want to create," and so on. I heard those suggestions continued for more than a year. Seeing how serious they were, our staff started pitching their proposals and reference materials to internal teams, and that's how it started. So to reiterate, we've got a team which is absolutely expert in the field of adventure games, but they have to spend a whole year pitching the external development leads at Nintendo before they were given a chance to even speak to Nintendo's internal development division. That, to me, sounds absolutely crazy. Even then, Sakamoto seemed to hold back at first, saying, "When I read the documents, I could feel Mage's enthusiasm, but I also wasn't sure how serious they were. Then I had a look at the graphics they created for the demo, and that's when I realized that they really were serious about it. It was when they created a scene from the missing air to show what they were doing with full graphics and characters that Sakamoto-san could see the potential, but it took even longer for him to really get into the weeds of development." He explains, "At first, I intended to join in a supervisory role, just reviewing what Mages created. But Mages said to me, 'Sakamoto-san, let's work on this together.' So I was like, really? Can I join too? As much as I like to get my hands on, I wasn't sure how far I could stick my nose into the project, or whether I could join in since it was Mages' idea. Then Miyachi-san said to me, 'Just join in.' So actually, I joined in and didn't hesitate to share my thoughts. By the end, I was so heavily involved that I wondered what had happened to my so-called supervisor role. I'm really grateful to Mages for accepting my opinions and giving them form." Now, perhaps this is a case of false modesty from a creative genius, but I do wonder. This reminds me a lot of the way that Mercury Steam originally pitched to do a remake of Metroid Fusion. This proposal was not taken up, but Sakamoto-san built up a relationship with them developing Samus Returns, which ultimately led to the emergence of Metroid Dread. What seems mad to me is that Metroid Dread had been an idea in his mind for nearly 2 decades at that point, and fans had heard the rumours and were incredibly excited by the possibility of the game. But partly through technological limitations of rendering the relentless Emmy robots, but also it appears from the lack of a decent collaborator who could help bring Sakamoto's vision to life, the idea had languished on the shelf for a very long time. Sakamoto-san had spent a long time at the heart of Nintendo's Entertainment and Production Group 7, but his neighbouring department, EPD6, is run by Kensei Tanabe, and I think it's telling to compare and contrast the 2 situations. Tanabe-san is constantly, it seems, pushing new games and new series, heavily involved in Paper Mario, Metroid Prime, Donkey Kong Country, Luigi's Mansion, but also taking on a whole number of other franchises along the way, including the first Chibi Robo, the Dylan games, and most recently taking on from Sakamoto's team the producership mantle for the WarioWare series. Tanabe-san is incredibly prolific, while Sakamoto-san is very much the opposite. He describes himself as having led the development of the Famicom Detective Club and Metroid series, but, and I quote, "On the other side of the spectrum, I've also worked on 2 titles from the Tomodachi Life series." Now, what I find really interesting about this is that arguably there have only been 2 Tomodachi Life titles, although to be fair, there are other games in the broader Mii universe, such as Miitopia, which of course came to the Switch as a port in 2021. My suspicion has long been that if another Tomodachi emerges, it may well be with different programming leads, either Grezzo after they remake Miitopia, possibly internally at Nintendo but with a team more across the casual titles such as EBT4, but not necessarily with Yoshio Sakamoto still involved as he does seem to be stepping back more and more. This particular comment is curious because he specifically says the Tomodachi Life series and only 2 titles from it. And of course different people might translate the original interview in different ways, but 2 titles from suggests to me that there are more than 2 titles in total, and so if there is a third, that Sakamoto-san will not actually be working on it. Given the success of Tomodachi Life on the 3DS, it being a top 10 seller for the system, and after the phenomenal success of Animal Crossing New Horizons for the Switch, Tomodachi Life has long been a curious absence from Nintendo's gaming slate, apparently a popular franchise in the kind of broad life sim genre that has done very well for Nintendo recently, and yet it hasn't seen a new entry. Is this another case of Yoshio Sakamoto simply not being as tenacious as other Nintendo producers in pushing his franchises into new game developments? He identifies himself as being a hands-on game developer, and inevitably this clashes with the skills you need to be a generalist producer, skills such as delegation and team building and people management. It seems that he only brought in Kaori Miyachi because she chased him for progress on the Emio concept. As he says, I worked together with Miyachi-san on this title on everything from creating the plot to script writing, considering and selecting background music to support the composers, as well as cutscenes and direction. That said, I'm credited as the game's producer again for this title. I would propose that the man needs someone with more producerial eyes alongside him, and this is where comes in Kaori Miyachi, a woman with a deep resume of shepherding Nintendo titles, but who has now been brought in as a very senior creative influence on the Famicom Detective Club games. I don't mean to paint her as someone who is all hard-nosed project management without a creative background. It's not really discussed in depth, but Sakamoto-san's comments do show that she has a real passion for the creative as well. He says, I also had an opportunity to read Miyachi-san's writing outside of the Famicom Detective Club game remakes. Her word choice and sense of rhythm resonated with me. While writing stories for games, I've always valued precise phrasing and how words sound rather than using complicated words like a novelist. And there was an apprenticeship that took place with Miyachi-san explaining. Sakamoto-san sent me various works that he considers essential in order to illustrate his core values. One day during development I was surprised to receive several DVDs, some of which were gory or horror movie-like. Sakamoto-san insisted that I watch them. I pleaded with him saying, these really aren't my cup of tea, but he insisted, please, I need you to watch them. So I plucked up the courage, and they were actually quite interesting. I learned so much from them and understood what Sakamoto-san wanted to express. She in turn recommended him manga which contained a number of dramatic twists and turns, showing her own creative values. The interview shows that Miyachi and Sakamoto really did work hand in hand, and that although the broad sweep of the story was his, she was instrumental in making sure the story was not too impossible to solve, and in fleshing out a lot of the dialogue and characters. One thing that really stood out to me playing Emio was the number of really funny moments there were, from quirky little references such as Basilisk Quest as a nod to Dragon Quest, through to the characters whose whole demeanour is comedic. Also, while Sakamoto stopped short of quite saying it explicitly, it seems that Miyachi was responsible for the increase in more colourful locations and making the game potentially more commercially appealing. Certainly, many of the locations are absolutely beautifully rendered by mages, and Sakamoto explains the thinking as follows. For better or worse, the previous games had an unrefined, gloomy atmosphere. That's part of Famicom Detective Club's charm, but for this title, we wanted a more colourful, vibrant feel. Famicom Detective Club games have always used humour to break up the sense of dread. That said, we still felt there was something heavy or gloomy lingering around them. Of course, that's always been our aim, and that hasn't changed in this game. However, we wanted to change the atmosphere in this game to make it less oppressive and more refined. We achieved this in the end, thanks to Miyachi-san's contributions. I believe that Famicom Detective Club's sunnier side has been enhanced in a good way. But perhaps the biggest revelation for the series comes at the end. Miyachi-san comments, we hope everyone will enjoy the game at their own pace, whether they're playing Famicom Detective Club for the first time or are long-time fans of the series, and it would be great if those people who play the game become a little kinder to the people who are always close to them. This is a theme in the game, and it seems to strike a chord, in particular with Sakamoto-san, and appears to be one of those core values which he mentioned earlier in the interview. He responds, "In fact, what you just mentioned, Miyachi-san, is really a constant theme for the Famicom Detective Club series, and to hear that come out of your mouth so naturally, I know I can count on you. Miyachi-san and I worked to create this new iteration, bouncing ideas off each other to keep developing them. So, fans of the series, rest assured, I have found the heir at last." She jokes, of course, "I'll do my best not to become the missing it." Now, while they were of course goofing around, I think this is still as close as we can expect from Nintendo as a confirmation that Famicom Detective Club will continue, and perhaps on the kind of 3-yearly schedule we've seen so far. I just don't think they'd even joked about it if it wasn't likely that we would see a new game at some point. They have an exceptionally dedicated development staff in Mages, and a 1-2 punch combination of the series' main creative force and another writer with long Nintendo experience and perhaps slightly more of a mind to getting games actually produced. At this point, I would say there is a 70% chance we will see the next Famicom Detective Club title before the end of 2028, and the favourite window would probably have to be the summer of 2027. Summer is normally a quiet time for Nintendo, but it does overlap with Japan's spooky season around the Festival of Obon, when people are reunited with spirits of the dead. And visual novels and adventure titles, while perhaps a little down from their highs in Japan, are still popular in the East, and so this kind of game clearly scratches an itch and has a natural space in Nintendo's calendar into which it could slot. Moreover, the games have a relatively niche audience, but their high price relative to content surely means they are a profitable endeavour for Nintendo, even despite the heavy toll of translation costs and voice performers for the many different characters in the game. However, one option that, based on this interview at least, I think is very unlikely to be on the table anytime soon, is a return to the Satellaview Famicom Detective Club title. The interview contains a review of the history of the series, although one surprising and slightly depressing twist to this is that it completely fails to mention at all the third Satellaview Famicom Detective Club game, the title of which I have seen translated in a few ways, including as The Past That Disappeared in the Snow. Not only does Sakamoto and Miyachi not mention it, but the interviewer refers to Emio as being the first new Famicom Detective Club title in over 30 years. It occurs to me in this case, Miyachi-san, given that it was an obscure title long before she joined Nintendo, might not even be particularly aware of the Satellaview version, and while I hope eventually that title is rescued from uber obscurity, as I would love to be able to play it, I think future Famicom Detective Club titles will be focused on the future and new games and new stories rather than remaking this title. Now, there is always the possibility that this could be revived for Nintendo Switch Online, or as a smaller project in the manner of Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, which of course got a translation a few years ago and was released just as a one-off purchase for a limited period. However, the heavy translation requirements of any Famicom Detective Club game means that it strikes me as a tricky prospect for release outside Japan, and the fact that Yoshio Sakamoto does not appear to have been heavily involved with that game may mean he has much less personal investment in seeing it brought back to life. I would love to have a chance to play a remake of this title, but for the time being, I won't be holding my breath. And this speaks to a broader truth about how Nintendo is run, which is that it really seems to be down to the particular interest and desires of its senior producers. I don't think that very often they sit down with a master list of franchises to review what they've got and what they can develop, but rather they are led by the creative passions of their top team. That is obviously a really good thing in lots of ways. I would hate for them just to monotonously churn out low-grade, uninspired sequels because they felt they had to. But it also means that franchises with loyal fan bases can go for years and years without attention simply because they don't have a champion to push these particular games. This was the rumour about the fate of Rhythm Heaven, and it certainly would explain the radio silence on a new Wario Land title over the last decade or so. It also shows why 2D Metroid, Famicom Detective Club, and possibly even Advance Wars were able to make their way back after a long break and with similar paths in terms of being a remake first from a passionate external studio, although I think we may circle back to explore this topic in a future videos of how remakes come to be, so I will pause the main part of this video at this point. So while I'm wrapping up the main part of the video, I said at the beginning that I would share some Emio thoughts of my own. I'm not going to share any spoilers, but I will talk about my impressions based on the whole game, so if you don't want even the risk of something that could affect your enjoyment of the title, please do check out lots of other videos on my channel, but turn back now as I will be talking about general impressions from the whole game. So, I know the big controversy with these titles is the amount of content relative to the price. It is true that while this is perhaps more substantial than previous Famicom Detective Club games, the title is still on the short side, about 11 hours, but it is a great mystery with brilliant moments of humour, as well as sinister elements and a number of great, memorable characters who have some different sides to them that emerge over time. I think I will be likely to revisit this title again in a few years, although mainly because my memory for mystery stories is terrible and I am capable of being surprised afresh, but also it is just a great experience with beautiful graphics and lovely characters. I think the Emio concept itself is a brilliant mix of the sinister and intriguing, and I like that we see how the urban legend doesn't just affect the characters themselves, but has a broader impact on the community. This sense of solving a mystery that is affecting the world in real time is particularly acute in this story. The game also does have an epilogue which helps to tie up loose ends and gives you a full picture of what's happened, and I have to say that just from a production standpoint, I found this epilogue pretty staggering. While the standard approach with games is to spend your budget in the beginning of a title where everybody gets to see it, unusually this game saves its budget for the end, with the post-game playing almost as an animated movie in many places. I don't know what portion of the budget went on the post-game, but it's pretty vast, and although it's not an overly long sequence, I did find it very satisfying. It also solves another mystery, which is the game's rating. For most of the game, it really is quite gentle, with violence only hinted at, and the game always eschews the gratuitous or gory where it can. They actually specifically forewarn players before accessing the epilogue that this is going to get a lot darker, and it does. To be clear, the game never dwells overly on violence, it's not gratuitously gory or trying to shock in that sense, but if your story is about a serial killer, some of that is inevitably baked in. The game has a lot of different colours to it though. Quite literally, there are beautiful locations and animations where it really does feel like you're playing an animated movie. This is just a beautiful game, and there's a diversity of different elements. There are great comedic moments, from out-and-out gags on the player. There's one in a bar where the game really pulls your leg, alongside characters who have some quite funny turns of phrase. Then the game is peppered with lots of little references and Easter eggs. For example, a shout out to Basilisk Quest 4, which I guess is a reference to Dragon Quest 4, which released in 1990, which is when this game appears to take place. And I absolutely love that. While it's not overly remarked upon, this game has a period setting. It picks up right after the previous titles. The time you see this most dramatically is in the use of the cell phone, which is a really great addition to the title, allowing you to cold call various people and even leave a funny message on the detective agency answering machine. It's not all fun and games though. There are moments where you are forced to reflect on the ethical choices you are making as you question suspects as a detective, with one moment where you particularly have to win some very difficult people around. The game is not perfect by any means. There is one quite important element to making the resolution work that I found a bit of a stretch. And while I love the sections where you get to play as Ayumi Tachibana, these were a little inconsistent. Some chapters have fairly substantial sections for her, but sometimes she's absent for almost the entirety of a chapter, and she can feel like a little more of a subplot. I would kind of like to see Ayumi be a more prominent and developed character in games to come, although I do admire that the game acknowledges quite directly the previous installments. It's subtle, not overbearing, but if you've played the prior titles you will notice that their events still matter to the characters, both the lead and to Ayumi. And although the developers haven't evolved the format of the Famicom Detective Club games overly from the 2021 remakes, everything does seem to flow. There are a few moments where you just need to go through every option and click everything on the screen until you find the precise combination needed to unlock the next sequence, and there is one puzzle involving selecting 3 people where the game doesn't give you much help at all, I find, but generally speaking these hitches just make you feel like a real detective getting stumped as to what to do next, and pushing through perseverance. Moreover, these are rare, and I would say much rarer than with the previous Famicom Detective Club title, and they never affected my enjoyment of the game. The conversations with witnesses and suspects flow really well, sometimes yes reaching dead ends, but often pushing through to new elements, and there's a satisfying gameplay rhythm to talking, thinking, and sometimes using other pausing activities like taking a sip of tea to allow your interlocutors the time to open up that bit more. As you get into the game, you really develop a sense of when to talk and when to hold back, when to be looking and when to be showing some of the evidence that you have to hand. As a game, I find Emio a fantastic entry in this series, and in admittedly a very slight year for original titles, it's my favourite so far. But it does come down to whether the cost for you of a relatively short experience is worth it. Personally, for me it was. I will revisit this title. I certainly have strong and enduring memories of playing it, as it delivers what superstar creator Vince Gilligan once called non-submersible images that stick with you long after the game is done. And personally, I'm just really delighted that this niche franchise seems to be becoming a Nintendo mainstay, and I would love to see other franchises with solid gameplay engines be revived. I'd love to hear how you found the game, although please don't drop any spoilers in the comments. But otherwise, please do check out one of these videos on screen, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.